So I've been thinking about stories, and it was great to hear Tom and Steve were also sharing some of their stories, and I think a key part of our lives, of our ministry, and of our church is the stories that make it up. And sometimes those stories are who we are, and sometimes those stories no longer are. I have a good friend in ministry who does a lot of work in restoring his life because he had experience as an addict and he realized that no longer defines him. And so now he's figuring out what stories he is going to hold on to. And sometimes we do that as individuals, and sometimes we do that as maybe a ministry area, and maybe sometimes we do that as a church. I think it's really powerful when you have people in your lives that can step into that space of helping you to understand what stories to let go of and what stories to really embrace. So when we look at Paul's ministry, in Barklee, we've been exploring the fruit of the Spirit. That's from Galatians, and the people in that church there were starting to hold on to the story that they needed to earn their salvation. And so Paul tells them, no, the fruit of the Spirit, that's a gift from God, and it comes from a life following Jesus, and not all the stuff that you do. So I was looking at our scripture today, and the story of what's going on in 1 Thessalonians. And this is something else Paul tells another church. See, that church is going through a really hard time, and he and Timothy had been there, and they were new Christians, and he's hearing word that they had faced persecution, and they're facing a lot of conflict, and he's worried about this new church, these people that are new in their faith, and they're not sure. He's not sure if they're strong enough to undergo these pressures. But he finds out, he sends Timothy, and he finds out that they are, and they're actually doing great. They're thriving. And so he shares this. He says, we loved you so much that we shared with you not only God's good news, but our lives too, our own lives too. So he's encouraging them, and he's uplifting them, and he's celebrating the life that they have together in ministry. Sometimes we think about ministry as all these separate different areas that we're doing, but the reality is, it's this woven together story. I want to share a story I came across just a couple weeks ago that was really powerful to me. This is a story of a woman whose experience in ministry transformed her. Let's go ahead and take a look at this video.
Wow, thank you. One of the things that is really, really important for me about empathy has always been this scripture passage, 1 Thessalonians 2:8. And it says, because we loved you so much. This is Paul speaking to the church there. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel, but our lives as well. And I've used that in training all the time when it comes to this particular part. That's the idea that we get to share our lives and what God's done for kids, right? And for us. And I remember one of the churches that I was at, I just started there. And this woman, Karen, she was the family ministries chair of the committee. And she was like, I am here to serve. I am here to serve you. I love what you do. I love what your team does. I'm so excited to do that. I'll cook food for you. You can have meetings at my house at any particular moment you want to. She goes, but do not ever ask me to hang out with kids. She goes, I don't really get them. I don't really like them. And they're a total mystery. And so I said, okay, that's fine. But as we were teaching and as we were doing training, she had to be there as the committee chair. And so she got to hear a lot of what we were training, and we trained a lot about what the empathy part was, right? We trained a lot on that. We trained what it meant to understand their journey in identity. And over time, over a couple years, I finally thought, you know what? I have Karen. She's great. Let me ask her again. And she said, I told you not to ask me that. Karen had the ability to be very clear about her boundaries. A couple months later, however, she actually came to me and she said, do you really think that I can understand these kids? And I said, absolutely. Why don't you just come? Why don't you just sit? Why don't you just begin to listen? And so she came to our youth nights, and in those youth nights, she was sitting in the background. She was just trying to hear, trying to understand. She's like, don't put me in a small group. I just want to understand. I want to listen. And so she did. She just listened for months, and finally she said, you know what? I'm going to sit with one of these groups over here. And after a while, she asked questions of this one particular girl, and this girl just opened up, and Karen's heart was broken for this girl. And she came to me that night and she said, I want to lead a small group with this girl and her friends. I think I can do this. Do you think I can do this? I was like, absolutely. Let's keep you moving, right? And along the way, she got to share, she got to care, she got to do stuff that she never thought she was going to be capable of doing. But that's not the amazing part, right? Like, we could tell a story about someone who gets it and then comes in. The amazing part was when Karen got diagnosed with cancer, she wanted her youth small group to be the ones to come around and pray for her, to be the ones that come and prayed with her. And I remember the moment that Karen passed away. It was her youth small group that was around with her. It was her youth small group that was caring for her in the midst of the cancer treatments. It was her youth small group that was stepping into this life with her. And I couldn't orchestrate that. It's only God that gets to do that. But when we teach the things of caring for people and loving them and sharing the gospel as well, you watch amazing things happen that you or I could never, ever design. And Karen showed me what it meant to do the empathy that I was teaching about, right? I believe in it. I absolutely believe in it. But there are moments where other people get to show us how great those relationships can become, because the gift that she was giving to those kids came back to her and her family tenfold. It's an amazing moment.
Yeah, so Karen's story changed. She thought she couldn't work with kids. She thought she didn't want to work with kids, but it changed. Now, something I've shared with some of you, I'm not sure if I've shared this with everyone, but I didn't grow up in a church. I had a great family. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, but for a lot of different reasons, we did not go to church. So I never had that experience. At some point in time, I kind of had a tug at my heart, and I had an interest to go to church. And we can explore a lot of different methods, theologies behind that, if that was maybe prevenient grace or experience I had with friends, I'm not sure. But all of a sudden I started to get a tug. And so I started going to church. I would go to church with family members, friends of my family. My friends' families, there we go. So I was one of the kids at the church. You never saw my parents. I was a friend. I hung out. I would have been here Wednesday nights. I would have been here Sunday. I would have gone to youth group. I would have gone to camp. I went on retreats. We had what was called Happening, and I remember being a part of that. And I had great relationships with the church. And eventually, I felt this tug on my heart, and I really wanted to become baptized. And my family was alongside that, and that happened. And then I went away to college. And when I came back home during the summer, one of the stories that I really remember was I was a college student at that time, and I don't know if you had this similar experience to me, but I fell into this rhythm of going to bed between like 12 and 2 in the morning. I'd do homework till then, and then I'd normally sleep until like 10 o'clock in the morning. To be up before 8 a.m. was just unheard of. But when I came home during the summer months, I coached a swim team. I worked with kids, and we had practices Monday through Friday, and then one of our meets was on Saturday, and then I had Sunday. That was my only day to sleep in. But every Sunday, I could drive at that point. Every Sunday, I would go to church. And it was Trinity Episcopalian Church in Wheaton, Illinois. It was a little church, and I didn't really know many people there. It was a small church. There was a lot of families. There was young people. There were old people. And there was Father Mike was there. And every Sunday I would go, and every Sunday when I'd come home from college, I would go. And every time I was there, he would stand at the back of the door in the receiving line, and he would welcome me with a warm hug. And he would always say, "Oh, it's so good to see you, Lori." And he'd be in all of his robes and everything. And I was a college student. My family wasn't involved. But he knew me by name, and he welcomed me every Sunday, every time I came home. And I went every Sunday during that entire summer. I never missed a Sunday. And anytime I had a fall break or a spring break or a Christmas break, whatever it was, I always went home. And it didn't have to be Father Mike. It could have been any other person in that church, but that's who knew me by name. That's who welcomed me home. And years went by after that, and things fell into place, and because of some key events in my life, I ended up here. And because of some key events in other people's lives, that I'm not going to go into this at this time, I was offered the job as the Upward basketball director. There's a lot of random things that fell into place, but I don't know that that's entirely random. But one key thing did happen during that time too, another part of my story. Some of you know Pastor Lori Blink-Gibson. She was an associate pastor here at the time, but now she's gone on to be a conference superintendent. And one email at one time before the start of a season, when I had communicated a lot of Upward information for a huge league that we were about to start, and this was my first time, she replied back and she wrote in that email, "Wow, thanks for all the information." And maybe she said other things, but there's one line that she said that changed my life. She said, "I can't wait to see where we can use you after Upward season." I've told her this story. I never thought of myself working in a church until she said that to me. I didn't know I had a place in the church. I didn't grow up in a church. What would the church use me for? What place would I have? So, somewhat like Karen in our story earlier, I found my way into a calling in the church through ministry with children. And so this Sunday we celebrate Barklee, and I want to share some of the stories that are a part of that ministry. Now, why did we do Upward ministry? Why did we start doing this maybe 15 years ago? Probably just a little bit older than that. Well, probably about 20 years ago, we were building the Trinity Life Center, this part of this building, the newer part. And Mike Ropp, who had been part of youth ministry for years and had been part of athletics and Elkhart for even longer than that, 40, 50 years, he went to a church somewhere and he saw an Upward basketball taking place. And he was changed. He said, "We need to do that. That's the best program I've ever seen. I've seen youth sports going on for years and years and years, and this is nothing like what I've ever seen." And so a team of people walked alongside him, and he was part of that, and Chris Lance and Mark Finstermacher, and there was all these people that made this happen. And we were right in the place that we were looking at, how can we use this building? How can we use this space? How can we connect with families? And we decided that Upward would be the way that we would do that. Now, one of the things that also connects with, we're doing this Is Us series. And one of the things from the United Methodist Church, from the Methodism, from the beginning, laid a heavy emphasis on social service and education. I found this quote: "Methodism has distinguished itself as a religious movement strongly tied to social issues. As the father of the movement, John Wesley injected much of his own social philosophy into the movement as a whole. The Methodist Church has always been strongly oriented towards the religious lives of the young. In 1848, the General Conference stated, 'When the Church has collected a great population born within her bosom, she cannot fulfill her high mission unless she takes measure to prevent this population from being withdrawn from under the care in the period of its youth.'" That's a fancy way to say that in 1848, the Methodist Church committed to being deeply involved in youth and children's ministry. So that's why we do Barklee. That's why we do Upward, actually. But a lot of times I get asked, why do we do Barklee? Why Barklee? So about 15 years, actually, let's go the other way with that. A couple of years ago, we had been doing Upward for about 15 years. And we started to get into this time where things weren't working well. And we realized that. We had these rules that we had originally adopted. We had these new rules that were being implemented. Upward was changing as an organization. We had some coaches that had been new and trained in the new rules, and we had some coaches that were, and then that put our Upward director in a really tough position, and there was a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of structure, things that just weren't working. And so COVID hit. And we had turned over 2 Upward sports directors that were burnt out and didn't feel the passion for the league because it was too hard. And so we went into this time of discernment. Because we're part of the United Methodist Church, we have a conference. We have a church conference, an Indiana conference, and we are part of the North District of the Indiana Conference of the United Methodist Church. And the Indiana Conference of the United Methodist Church has resources available to us because we are a connectional church. And so one of the resources they had available to us was a coach. And so we engaged in this conversation and we said, hey, can you walk alongside us? We need to evaluate a ministry that's really challenging for us right now. And so during COVID, on Zoom, we had a small team, about 6 people, that went through this really prayerful process that asked these really tough questions and had a really hard time coming up with a decision. But eventually we felt called to do our own league, to do something that spoke to us and allowed us the freedom to try something new, try something that was more connected to our United Methodist roots. It meant that we would write our own rules based on what worked for us. We would write our own devotions based on what we believed. That we would create our own volunteer roles based on what we were able to do, what we were willing to do, and what we felt led to do to walk alongside families. It meant that we were no longer doing coach commissioners, no longer doing referees, but instead, we created these new roles like champions in our cafe and our greeter and the areas that we knew were working well. And we named this league, Barklee, after Randy Majeska, who some of you know. He was a special needs individual that was a key part of our congregation several years ago, had passed away for natural causes. But he would show up on game days, and he would wear this dog costume that I actually still have hanging in my closet, but he would show up to cheer on the kids for however long he wanted to because he loved doing that. So we thought, he called himself Barklee, Barklee the dog mascot, and we thought that's what we're going to do. Fortunately, we have a Barklee director that knows a lot about basketball, and he told me, you do not want to associate with Charles Barkley. That is a different image, and I don't think that we want to put out that we're doing a clinic or a league because people will think it's a Charles Barkley league. So I said, okay, good point, let's change the name, spelling. So we switched up the spelling a little bit. That's why we spell a little bit different. Otherwise, in the sports world, people would think we are putting on a Charles Barkley league, and we were not. We were putting on a Randy Majeska-inspired ministry. And so that's why we do that. And we tried something new. And that's what we celebrate today. And so when we hear those words of 1 Thessalonians, that Paul speaks to that church, they speak encouragement to us too. Do we face hard times? Yeah. Do we know our families that walk in our building every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday for Barklee? Do they face hard times too? Absolutely. But do we want to show our love and our support and our encouragement through sharing our lives? Yeah, that's why we do this ministry. Now, you may have noticed that we have a growing amount of children here. That is a good thing. That is a God thing. But they need to be known. They need to be welcomed. They need to be celebrated. Fuller Youth Institute, which is where that video came up with earlier, has a model for sticky faith, and they say that every one child should have 5 adults in a church community that knows them by name, that says, hi, Max, hi, Bryn, I'm glad to see you, that welcomes me like Father Mike welcomed me every Sunday. 5 adults to every one child. So if you don't know 5, I invite you to, because they're here. One of the questions that the Indiana Conference is asking and exploring is something that goes around an initiative from the bishop. The bishop is kind of the highest force that we have in the United Methodist Church. We have a council of bishops. The Indiana Conference has an Indiana bishop. Other conferences, some states, being the size of them, have one, maybe a north or south, depending on their conference size. Some smaller states have one per couple states. But our bishop created an initiative a little while ago that's called Children Matter Most. And around that, he created a committee. And that committee meets monthly. And our bishop, who has a lot of commitments and a lot of ministry opportunities, sits in on that committee every month because the children matter most to him. And one of the things that committee is looking at is the question of where are the children in the church? And what they've circled back around to is the problem isn't the answer. The problem is the question. There are children all over the community. There are children all over our church. They're here on preschool days. They're here on Barklee days. They're here when we do Riverview celebrations. They're here on Wednesday nights. They're here on Sunday mornings. So it's a matter of how do we connect with them? And so that's what the question is. Now, we know it may be different. Life when I was growing up was different than life when you were growing up, which is different than life when my children are growing up. We know that. Life was different for Paul in his church, in our scripture that we had today. And it's not our job to evaluate that difference or that change. It's our job to love those that come into our building every day, whether it be a hug, a high five, a fist bump, whatever you feel comfortable with. We share our lives with one another, and that's how and why we do ministry. That's why and how we do Barklee. That's why and how we do creative arts camp and summer camp. It's not so that we can learn those skills, that's a bonus and a plus, but it's so that we can do life together, so that we can share our witness to the world. So when we talk about stories and restorying, we have some stories that we hold on to that are no longer true. Maybe they're myths. One of those myths is that young people are looking for hip pastors and cool leaders. It's easy to buy into that. I've sometimes bought into that. But what we know and what we see is that they can find cool leaders and hip pastors in the world. They can find it on YouTube. They can find it on, I was going to say Facebook, but they're not on Facebook, Instagram or Snapchat or wherever they might be. They're looking for authentic relationships. They're hungry for connection that matters. And I'll be honest, I've realized I am definitely not a hip young pastor or cool leader. In fact, when we went on this Spring Hill retreat, we had this great moment where something happened in the worship setting. It was really funny, and I was laughing, and all the kids were laughing, and I was like, did you think that was funny too? And they said, no, we just think it's funny. You think it's funny. And I realized they were laughing at me, and that's okay. That happens more often than not. I'm fine with that. I'm happy to walk alongside them when they are laughing, even if it's at me. Because here's the thing, they're wrestling with this really hard work of identity and belonging. And fortunately, I'm at a place in my life where I've done a lot of that hard work. So I'm happy to walk alongside them while they're doing that. Another myth that sometimes we fall into, and sometimes I like to do, is that it's my job to do children's ministry because I'm the children and family pastor. And the problem I have with that is I love to do children's ministry. But I always have to every day remind myself it's my job to equip you to do children's ministry. Because as a United Methodist Church, as we know our pastors come and go, it's our job as pastors to equip our church to connect with emerging generations, with future generations, with all generations in transgenerational ministry, intergenerational ministry. And And I was thinking the other day while I was in the chapel, we bring our kids together on Wednesday nights there while our adults are going through the line, and then our kids eat next. And I was thinking, I've served on committees that have people 20 to 30 years older than me. And I stood in that room in the chapel with these kids that were 20 to 30 years younger than me, and I thought, I wonder if this is going to be our next church council meeting or ad council board, or who knows? Who knows who these kids are? Maybe they are the leaders of our church. Maybe they're the friend of the friend, like I was in a church 10 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago. There's another myth sometimes we make the mistake of making, and that is that children don't contribute to the church now, but that they're the future of the church. But when we restory it and we think about it, we know that children and young people add vitality to our church. They're the stories like we saw with Karen, the people that walked alongside her while she was dying. They offer energy, new ideas. They serve in our praise team in our second service. They lead prayer time. If you were a part of our creative arts camp experience, so many of our youth were involved, and they helped in our groups, and they were doing ministry with children younger than them. And when we go to summer camp, we do that same thing. Our youth serve as discipleship makers for our children, and that's hard work. It is hard for them. They need people to walk alongside them. I love it when my teenage children come to me and say, Mom, do you realize how hard it is working with kids? And I say, oh, tell me about that. We can talk for a while on that one. But they need you. They need you to walk alongside them. Our teenagers need you to walk alongside them as they are discipling children. We have some of our youth I saw yesterday serving in our cafe, and I love that people have connected with them. We have some of our youth that are serving as assistant coaches in our basketball team. And I know some of you are walking alongside them. So they need you. And they contribute to the church in powerful and in amazing ways now. And so it swells my heart, and it brings me so much joy to think about that kingdom work that's going on through Barklee Ministry. And I invite all of you who are involved in all different kinds of ministry areas to think about how you can have children and youth involved in your ministry area, because that is all of our jobs. That's who we are. As a United Methodist Church, as a global church, as a church of Jesus Christ. One of the things that I'm not going to go into now, but I would invite you to look into, but many of you are probably familiar with the United Methodist Book of Discipline. We also have a book of resolutions, and this expounds on this. It's our social principles. And there are probably 30 pages dedicated to putting children and their families first. This is who we are. This is our engagement in the future. And so this is our commitment, not just as Trinity on Jackson Church, but as the United Methodist Church across the world. And so that is why we do Barklee ministry. And because we are called to the ministry that began by John Wesley, we are invited to be innovative and to explore new ways to create community, new ways to walk alongside children and families. And so, through years of history, through discernment, this is why we do Barklee here.